All righty. We're going to go ahead and get started. All right. Well, thank you everyone so much for joining us today. I'm Quentin Smith, and today from our product marketing team here at CaptivateIQ. And today we're going to be talking about all about how CaptivateIQ can help your team unlock efficient growth with your sales planning process with CaptivateIQ Planning. So this is the introduction of our newest product, CaptivateIQ Planning, in addition to our existing product of CaptivateIQ Incentives. And we're so excited to delve in to the sales planning process, and since it is the season for most people at the moment, in addition to talking to some broader experiences and then getting a preview of the product live. So with that in mind, I want to do a quick round of introductions before we start here. The first of which introducing one of our subject matter experts, Andrew Morales from our ops team. So Andrew, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks everyone for taking the time to join. Super excited to be here this morning, chatting through all things planning, how we're solving some of these challenges here at Captivate IQ. I've been in Captivate IQ for about a year, but within the RevOps space for over 10 years now. I'm a husband, a father, a son. I'm super passionate about all things forecasting, planning, passion, yes. Love to hate relationship, maybe, but anytime you want to talk about forecasting, I'm here for it. Devin, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself to the team.
Yeah, Devin Amaris, Enterprise Solution Engineer here at Captivate. I kind of came up through finance and sales operations. So I was in a lot of your shoes, managing this entire process manually through spreadsheets and having wonky data that I had to massage and manipulate. And so ended up using a solution like this and definitely realized the benefits of it. So been at Captivate for 9 months after spending 11 or so years at other vendors in the space. But I'm on the call today to give the live demo of the product and get your guys' eyes on it. So happy to be here.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Andrew and Devin. They lend a lot of different experience both for these processes and the product itself. So really looking forward to getting their expertise. With that said, before diving into the content, we have just a couple quick housekeeping items that I wanted to run through. The first of which is that the session will be recorded. So if you have to hop off early or you miss something, not to worry, we'll be sending that up as a follow-up. In addition to that, if you have questions that pop up throughout, feel free to drop those in the chat. We'll either answer those in real time or save for the end when we'll have a formal Q&A. So if you have something, we'd love to answer those. And if we don't have the answer, we'll make sure to get it for you. So please, if you have anything top of mind, feel free to share. With that in mind, let's dive into the content. All right, so I want to talk through a brief agenda of what we're going to be talking through today. So we're going to start by just talking about an overview of the sales planning process. What does this look like end to end? But we're specifically today going to be focusing a lot on the territory carving and planning process. Beyond that, we're going to move into allow Andrew to reflect on his personal experiences, trials, and tribulations of the sales planning and territory carving process. As you mentioned, maybe the love-hate relationship that exists there. And then I'll talk a little bit about our approach or what he's seen as best practices there, reflecting on some of the pains as well as how he's mitigated that in the past. And then the big moment everyone's been waiting for, we're going to have Devin jump into a live demo of the product, show you what we've been working on at CaptivateIQ here for the past year, building a product to support the sales planning process. And lastly, let you walk away with some takeaway tactics, regardless of how you're solving this today, to help you better manage the sales planning process that you might be undergoing right now. So with that in mind, let's dive into our actual content. All right, so when it comes to this end-to-end sales planning process, I think most folks are aware that this can oftentimes make or break your year before it even starts. There's so much that goes into this really expansive process from end to end before it really even starts. It's not just about setting those goals, but it's about aligning those resources, setting the right targets, and delivering incentives that are going to drive your business there. So it can be really daunting at times for businesses, but also is so important to driving revenue growth and also effectiveness and productivity in your business. So the way we've framed it, or the way we see it, is really this five tiered process between top-down budgeting from your finance or executive teams to give you direction there. Then capacity planning, make sure that you have the sellers in seat to support those different goals. Then moving to territory planning, how do you allocate your resources properly to make sure you have coverage? Then moving into actually setting the targets based on that coverage for your different sellers. And lastly, building out those incentives, something long that CaptivateIQ has had a passion for, and that are going to help your sellers be driven towards those different targets that have been set for them. However, for the sake of the discussion today, we're really just focused on two different areas when it comes to the sales planning process. The first of which is the territory planning, how you carve out this territory to make them equitable across the business, and then the target setting, quota setting process aligned with that. So with all of that in mind, I want to take a second to allow Andrew to speak to his years of different experiences with the sales planning and territory carving processes, what he's seen be successful, any sort of relevant experiences there, just to get his perspective there. So Andrew, I'll pass it over to you. Do you mind sharing a bit more here?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mentioned at the top of the call that my background has been predominantly in the RevOps space. And with that comes a fairly love-hate relationship with annual planning and territory carving as a result. What I will say is that from my experience and then also chatting with peers in the space, that this is really the time when RevOps teams can differentiate themselves and set themselves apart in terms of helping a business connect the overarching approach of planning for the next fiscal year and getting a team ready to be set up and execute successfully and getting started fast out of the gate. And if I look back on the previous experiences and conversations that I've had, there's two kind of pain points they really come up, which we'll dive quite a bit more detail into in just a moment here around territory carving, specifically within our planning process. And the first one being a lack of maturity in carving processes. This is something that typically only comes up once, maybe twice a year. Yes, you are managing territories as you go throughout the year. You might be making changes or iterations, but this like really big moment of carving, setting territories, books of businesses typically only happens a couple times a year. And so with that, we have processes that we're using throughout this process, but we're not tending to them throughout the year. You know, we kind of dust them off at the beginning of planning again, or we don't remember what those are. And so we're like recreating the wheel every single time. So that lack of maturity around defined and mature processes is a really big pain point. And then the second one being around collaboration, which we'll be talking about in a little bit more detail as well. So how do we get input from various stakeholders, be able to disaggregate, reaggregate information, make changes within the files that we're actually carving in. Those are two of the pain points that we run into pretty commonly. And what does that end up doing in a negative aspect if we don't get those two things right? We end up starting the year with a lot of confusion and a lot of questions from our reps. Why did something change in my territory, in my book of business? Why are we changing definitions of accounts or equity within territories or books of business? And those questions, what they actually really lead to is a lack of productivity across your selling organization. And lack of productivity directly translates into missing ARR targets. So this is a pretty critical moment to get right for your team. Carving territories, books of businesses, setting your team up to get a fast start out of the gate means that your team has a fair shot at hitting their plan for the year and not start the year out with dragging right away. So that's kind of an overview of some of the like high level pitfalls that we see, and we're going to dive into those in quite a bit more detail about the territory carving process and some key takeaways that I believe are important to keep in mind as you're getting ready for carving this year.
Super helpful, Andrew, and I appreciate all that different context. I think the weight of the process can't be undervalued throughout like your experiences and just most folks who handle that sales planning process. So appreciate your context on that front. And we're going to get a lot deeper on that, fortunately. So we've really split out the territory and quota planning process into these 5 key steps and really how we see this and how we see navigating that as a business. So these 5 key steps are requirements gathering. So upfront, ahead of time, making sure that folks are aligned, we know what to expect on that front. Then there's data prep and connection steps, which cannot be understated how critical and how tedious and manual this oftentimes is. And you're oftentimes even having to circle back to it later on. Territory carving itself, so making sure that your territories are distributed in an equitable and reasonable way on that front. Then moving into as Andrew mentioned, the collaboration, making sure the right folks have the right amount of input. And lastly, pushing that out for execution, making sure your sellers are able to actually go out and execute on each of these different tactics. So with all that in mind, we're going to delve into the kind of the specifics of these and maybe some of the challenge that Andrew has seen on each of these different fronts. So Andrew, I'll pass it over to you to speak to on the requirements gathering front, some of the pains that you've seen directly here and maybe how you mitigated those or have you seen be successful in mitigating those in your experience?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the things to just level set as we go through these 5 areas is the structure that I'll introduce is kind of a brief overview of the pain that I'm feeling, and then takeaways, things that I've learned or peers in the space have learned, knowledge that's been shared with me. And the whole goal here is that you all hopefully take away a couple of points that you can put into place today to help you have a successful carving process as you get through planning for next fiscal year. So requirements gathering to me is a really critical step. It goes without saying that defining what it is that you're trying to do sets you up for having a really good carving process. But this is one of the areas that typically doesn't get a lot of attention right out of the gate. And what happens is that we've gone through a bunch of iterations of planning, capacity planning, we're setting the number, and then we go to start carving the territories, and we get right into action without taking the time to take a step back and assess what is the thing that we're trying to do. And what this ends up creating is a lack of internal alignment and a lack of clear objectives of what we're trying to actually achieve as a result of carving for this fiscal year. So my takeaway here is using more formal program management structures. So defining your problem statement, building timelines, building a clear work back schedule is really important. And build timelines that account for some of the things that we're going to call out in pain points for the remaining steps of territory carving is probably the biggest learning that I've had over the years of doing this. Getting into feedback from managers and our senior leaders, and then having to recarve something, not taking that into account when I'm thinking about timelines up front, has set me back in previous years. The other thing that's really helpful here with defining more formal program structures is define your RACI. So who's responsible, who's accountable, who's a contributor, who's informed for the different steps of actually territory carving. And it'll help you outline who needs to be involved, and then back to those work back schedules and timelines as well. The other thing that can pop up here as we think about like requirements gathering is making sure that we're trying to capture appropriately the scope and not run into scope creep. Territory carving can absolutely balloon up into trying to solve foundational problems at the point that we're carving territories for next fiscal year. So get really clear again as to what is that clear objective that you're trying to do. And my takeaway here is to try to help reduce that scope creep. Know what you did last year really well. So that looks like documentation, taking the time to do a retro after last year or before you get started this year, take a look at what you did last year and define all the things that you didn't accomplish last year. And then use your takeaway from the first part, which is a more formal program structure, to identify what's going to change from last year to this year. And that again will help you make sure that you're wrangling the scope appropriately.
That's super helpful, Andrew. And yeah, couldn't agree more. It's just so important to understand exactly what you're trying to achieve here because you will run into an array of different challenges and issues that might deter attention away from accomplishing this in a reasonable timeline. So very much aligned to that approach there. Let's move into the data prep and connection piece. So I know that Andrew, you and I have talked extensively about this topic, but love to just get kind of your experiences there, and maybe some of the ways that you've found best practices you've found on this front.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is one of those areas that after requirements gathering, this is the area that has caught up with me actually quite a bit in the past in terms of creating a lot of rework or slowing down my territory carving process. So data is critical to carving for a fiscal year. It is absolutely foundational to being able to build effective territories and plans. And so a couple of the challenges that we run into here is that the first one being we have a lot of data sources that we're typically pulling data in from and various data structures with varying levels of cleanliness as well. And we need to aggregate those into a singular point of view or data source that we then use for carving. So really what the takeaway here is taking the time upfront to plan. As you've gathered your requirements, you define and document the data sources that you need and the various data points that you're going to be using to carve will help you identify what are the types of data that I need, what needs to be cleaned or not cleaned before I actually get started, and then being able to define what is that central source of truth for that data. Additionally, for that single source of truth as well, building that single source of truth to start carving in a scalable fashion is really important. Inevitably, in the middle of carving, you're going back, needing to make changes, which we'll talk about as well. So make sure that when you're joining data, when you're prepping data, you're leaving yourself breadcrumbs along the way so that if you need to go back, you can understand why it is that you made that decision. And those breadcrumbs to me look like documentation. They're notes that I leave myself. I'm even copying and pasting what the formula is that I use to make sure that I have a clear understanding when I'm trying to backtrack. What is it that I did and why did I do that? The next thing that we run into here quite a bit is scalability of the data. So here at CaptivateIQ, we're carving for this year. We've got about 125,000 Salesforce records, account records within our instance. That absolutely balloons up as companies grow and as companies get larger. You're then joining that data with other data sources. Your central source of truth can get really big really quickly. So designing your data models to ensure that you're capturing just the data that you need and you've done some of that cleaning and joining up ahead of time will help you make sure that you're creating something that's performant and scalable as you go through the carving process. The last thing that I would say that's a pain point is when you're transforming data after you've aggregated it, you've built your single source of truth, you're then making changes to that data. So that could look like I'm building account scores, or I'm building tiers of accounts, or I'm building what equity across accounts looks like. So I'm transforming the data that I've already got in place. And inevitably, when I'm doing that, I'm making changes or identifying new data that I need to bring in. And so taking the time to document as I'm going through that process, what is the transformation that I need to do? What is the KPI that I need to measure? And then taking the time to ensure that, again, I'm leaving myself breadcrumbs along the way and notes so that I can go back and make changes as needed.
Awesome. Thanks for that context, Andrew, and couldn't agree more on kind of the foundational nature of this piece and how easy it is to manage all of that and lead into that documentation for yourself so you can have that sense of sustainability or peace of mind when you inevitably have to go back. So with that in mind, this all is leading into the actual carving itself. So this critical process where you're truly doing the distribution of those accounts and modeling that out. Love to hear from you similarly on the kind of challenges and then best practice you found to go through this process.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we've taken the time to gather our requirements, we've taken the time to build our central source of truth from a data model standpoint, this should be a pretty successful step in the process. And doesn't mean it's not going to come without pains or without challenges, but taking the time up front to lay those two foundations around requirements and data sets me up to have a really good process in terms of carving out accounts, territories, and books of business. A couple of the things that I've run into in the past, and I know my peers in the space have run into in the past as well, is when you actually get into carving, inevitably you identify a data point that you need. Like, I needed that data point from the account, or I need to introduce another source of data to the carve at this point in time to be able to create equity or balance books of business or territories, whatever it might be. I think the thing that's really important here as a takeaway is that to move quickly. So inevitably, what I tend to want to do is to go back to my central source of truth data and introduce the data point there so that I can use it at scale for the rest of my carve. But there's a time trade-off that I'm making there. So making a decision quickly of, is it going to make more sense to go back to my central source of truth and introduce that data point? Or can I append my data at this step of my carve and keep moving? Taking the time to like be able to make that decision quickly is going to set you up for success. I think the most important takeaway from here is then once you're done with this step of the process and introducing, say you append the data at the step that you're in, go back, document, and introduce it into your source of truth, because inevitably you're going to want to use that data again. And what that'll do is when you're making changes based on feedback that you're getting from the org, you're no longer having to remember to reappend that data or what is the step that you did. You've taken the time to go back and introduce it into your source data as well. The last thing that I would say here is that oftentimes when we're carving in, say, Sheets or Excel, we're using a lot of lookup functions, a lot of index match. And what is really helpful here is to use reference formulas, reference variables, and reference tables as much as possible. Again, what that allows me to do is leave myself breadcrumbs along the way so that inevitably when I need to make a change, which is a big pain point, I'm not having to go deep into a nested formula to make a hard-coded change. I'm changing a variable that I've referenced. And as long as I've set up my data model to be performant, I should be able to allow that variable to cascade through the rest of my carve without degrading performance or slowing me down in carving.
Super helpful, Andrew. And I think just understanding where all that data is coming from and having those lookup tables to go back to and reference, it just makes it a more sustainable process. So couldn't agree more there. So once you kind of carved out those territories, yeah, you feel strong about like how things are equitably distributed. There's obviously going to be some insights that you're missing from the sales team, sales management folks who might have anecdotes that just aren't covered in your territory model. So this collaboration alignment phase allows you to loop that in. So curious how you've handled this, maybe some pains and how you've mitigated those in the past.
Yeah. So a couple of the things that come up here is what we're essentially having to navigate here is collecting feedback from the organization and then making changes to the carve that we've actually done. So we typically take a first approach or first pass based on our requirements. We've then carved out what territories books of business look like. We're then getting input from maybe sales managers, sales leaders, and then we inevitably have to go in and make changes. So a couple of things that come up from pain is who can have access to what data and the visibility of that at the carving process. I've worked at companies previously where peer manager groups were not allowed to have access to see the carve of their peer as well. So defining what it is that people can have access to and what visibility rates they have is really important. I think that the way that we can help our organizations through that change then as well is taking the time to record short videos of ourselves walking through the data will help people understand when they do get access to that carve, what is the structure of that carve, and then how they can actually provide feedback as well. The other thing that I think is really important here as well is defining standard intake mechanisms for how you want to actually take in feedback and then drive that change within your carve. So is it a form fill? Do you want people to comment directly in the doc? Do you have drop-down chips that you use within your files that you want people to make changes? Or is it free form? Taking the time to document it and telling your team how you want to receive that input will be critical to you being able to navigate this step successfully. And then the last part that I think is a key takeaway here is defining your feedback steps at the beginning will help you appropriately account for how much time this is going to take. Getting feedback, recarving, making changes, and getting sign off can take time. And so taking the time to outline what is the expectation of the org, what does that feedback loop look like and collaboration loop look like, make sure that you're giving yourself enough time to get this done.
That's great input. And I think that all leads to how we're actually going to push this out to the field and get those in the hands of the team. So to close this out here, Andrew, would love just for you to reflect on kind of this final phase of the process that moves you past the territory carving into those next execution phases.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the thing that really stands out for me here, and this is what's really critical from an operations perspective, is QA. So we've taken all this time to go through carve territories, carve books of business, and now we are getting ready to say this is final, this is approved. We're going to load this in on a specific day so that everybody has all the changes for the next fiscal year. Taking the time to QA is critical so that you are setting your organization up for success. You've set clear expectations for what they can expect, and QA ensures that those expectations are being met. The really critical takeaway here is don't assume that people will QA the way that you would expect them to. So define what is expected of them in QA. Be specific around, I want you to look at the accounts by person, or look at territories aligned to specific people, look at equity across these variables. Defining your QA requirements and then ensuring that people are using those requirements to give feedback is massively critical to having success here, and ensuring that your organization is successful in kicking off the year.
Awesome. Appreciate that, Andrew. And I think those are just great anecdotes to really think through this process. It's obviously you have a ton of experience with this and have done a good job of mitigating those common pitfalls by just continuing to document, create and repeatable and sustainable ways to really model out your territories and make them effective. So obviously there's some shortcomings with spreadsheets and ways of doing this, but I think the ways you've outlined just are super effective. So with all that in mind, I want to actually think about, so with regard to this process, think about how CaptivateIQ is thinking about this with our new product, CaptivateIQ Planning. So I want to actually pass it over to Devin, who's going to be walking through a live demo of what CaptivateIQ Planning looks like in practice and how that maps back to some of these different tactics that Andrew has mentioned today so far. So with that, Andrew, I'm going to pass it over to you. Or to Devin, apologies.
Perfect. Thanks, Quentin. Yeah, I want to start with data, right? That's one of the pain points that Andrew mentioned. It's really pulling in data from different sources, being able to massage and manipulate it and add certain variables or attributes that you need to use in the downstream process of territory planning. And so at Captivate IQ, we take a sort of no-code approach to how we integrate and manage data. And so in this example, we're pulling in, say, existing account information directly from our CRM, and we can pull in through an automated fashion any of that data in any sort of format. And so we have a lot of information around the ARR. If we have intended growth that we might need, we can include that in there, prospect scores. We can also have formulas in here to say, hey, if the go-to-market segmentation is enterprise, then use 0.1% in calculate a proposed quota that we can then use down the road. We also have prospect data, which we're also using as well as we carve up and allocate accounts and prospects to our various territories. And then we have things like a state mapping. And so I know within our organization, we have an enterprise team that's split between the Northeast, West, and Central. And so we have a simple table in here that kind of maps all the individual states to the region that they should be in. And ultimately, this is just going to make the process of allocating accounts down the road much easier, because for the Northeast enterprise territory, I can reference this field now. And whether it's Connecticut, Delaware, Maine, New Hampshire, what have you, it's going to map it into this region. And then I can just query off that and assign all the appropriate accounts to the Northeast region. And so that's another example of how we can store additional attribute data, which ultimately we're merging all together in a no-code approach so that we can have all of our prospects, all of our accounts, the derived proposed quotas that we have, the new regional mapping that we have in there as well. That obviously this is going to update and change as you say import new accounts or update your CRM data that feeds in. We can automatically assign these attributes and values to it. And so that's sort of the data side of it, right? We want to bring in that different data, be able to manipulate and really get it into a single state that you can then use as part of the carving process. And so to do that, we go into territory and quota. We can have multiple models within here. And so most folks perhaps do this once per year. And so maybe you have one planning cycle per year, or maybe you do it more iteratively if you have a lot of change within your organization. We have one 2025 plan in here. And we currently have one T&Q model, but of course you could have multiple if you want to do maybe direct sellers in one model and indirect in another, or your BDRs, maybe our overlays or something like that. And so you can have multiple models in here. With each of those, you choose what data is driving this process. And so we have that consolidated data file with all of our quotas and scores and state mapping and everything in there. And you can choose how frequently you want to refresh this, right? We don't want to maybe automatically do it because you're in the process of collaborating with sales leaders and whatnot. We don't want things to shift around, but you can always sync this whenever you need to. If you are making updates, maybe you're adding that new data attribute because you realized you needed it as part of your carving process. You add that to the system of record, it maps in, and now you can sync that with this process. If I go into the T&Q model itself, this is where we're going to have our hierarchy. And so we can upload these territories, we can create ones directly within here, but it kind of forms this hierarchical tree, starting with sort of the root territory and flowing down into different regions and segments and whatnot. And so we have some named accounts, some enterprise, some growth, and some international things. We can see at this point that we've loaded 100 accounts across 26 territories, and we've calculated the average per territory. Now, the nice thing about this is within these territories, you can add additional columns. And so even though this might not be part of the data, we can add in logic to do further calculations within here. In this example, we're simply taking the ARR or the quota that we've assigned at the counts and then aggregated it by territory. So as you start dealing out accounts and applying that logic to choose which should go into which territory, you'll be able to have these numeric values that are obviously automatically aggregating for you. So you can see the total by those territories. And so in this example, we have ARR, we have quota. We've also allowed for manual input if you want to adjust some value. And then we have our final quota here. So at this point, we've ingested our data, consolidated our data, added some additional logic to put in the state mapping and the proposed quotas. We've loaded it into this model with our various territories. And now we're we're ready to start allocating those accounts across our territories. So within the root here, I have 100 accounts, and so I can go ahead and deal those and choose how I want to do that. And so I'll start with go-to-market segmentation, but you have available to you all the various fields that were in that original data set. So if I choose this and say it's equal to enterprise, you then have all the territories available to which to map these. And so I have North America. And so I'll run this, and now it's going to evaluate all 100 accounts, say how many are enterprise, and then it's going to move them right into my enterprise territory. So if I click on that, I can see it took 32 and map those over. And now from there, I can go even further and say, okay, if account tier is equal to tier 1, then I want to move it to several different accounts. So I can say, grab all the ones that are in North America, and I can do either round robin or snake as an option. So I'll choose round robin. And now it's going to find among those 32 accounts, how many are tier 1, and then it's going to evenly and equitably distribute those across the various tiers or territories that I have within North America enterprise. And of course, I can always go back over to my accounts and click on any of these and see which accounts are in there. So we allocated 2 into North America Northeast. And so at this point, this is just an example of how we can take these accounts, use logic, use those attributes that we either ingested from our system of record or added as part of that data cleansing process. And now we can write rules and logic to equitably distribute them across our various territories. At this point, I want to sort of get input from others, right? I've taken that first swag, I've used the logic that I have, but I know that some sales leaders or sales ops folks might have more street level knowledge around the accounts and the relationships. And so maybe I want to allow them to have their input and say. I can then collaborate on this with anyone. And so we have Sally Sales Ops assigned to this particular region. And so if I go back and look at the territories, I can see I've assigned some of those out. And so when I assign someone to that territory, they'll get an email notification, they click on it, and then it'll bring them to this area within the T&Q. And so Sally Sales Ops was added as a collaborator at the North American enterprise level. So that's all she's going to have a purview into. And if I go ahead and refresh this, now that I've added some accounts in here, you'll see the territory now has those accounts within there. And I can come in and I can propose, changes, or I could add comments, right? So I can say, please adjust by 10K. I can leave a comment, and now that's available within there. And so we can see all the comments and notes that have been added previously down here. And this is where those individuals that are collaborating can propose a change, say, hey, I want to move this account from the Northeast to the Southeast, or I want to add an adjustment. I know the quota rolls up to this, but this account just had some layoffs, and so we want to reduce that or mitigate any risk that we might have there. If I come back in here, we'll now have that additional comment within there, so we can see all that within the territory, right? We now have the 3, so we can see that adjustment, and I can come in and make any changes here that I want. So I can add in 10,000, and then I'll automatically adjust this quota by that value. And so that's sort of the process, right? We're bringing the data in, we're analyzing the territories that we have, we're using rule-based logic to identify which accounts we want to move where, and then we can use that round robin or snake approach to equitably distribute them across our various territories as a first swag. And then the biggest thing is, instead of having a siloed or broken process where there's multiple workbooks and worksheets flying around through email and none of them kind of align to one another. Everyone's working from one system of truth. And so we can add collaborators, they can add their input, propose changes, have that go through a workflow for approval. And ultimately we'll have a final consolidated data set that has all of those inputs incorporated, which we can then move over for the purposes of incentive comp, whether it's their attainment to goal or tracking incentives or simply for reporting purposes. And so I'll pause there. Talk to this. Go ahead, Quinn.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Devin. And yeah, I can't emphasize enough, like Obviously, we've seen what this process can look like in spreadsheets, where, as Andrew was chatting through, you're refining all of that data, maybe across different systems. It's difficult to aggregate. You might run into errors, and you're constantly having to go back to refresh. Things like you're going through actual territory carving, using rules and formulas, and more, and then actually just aligning. A lot of that can be difficult there. We've really purpose-built CaptivateIQ Planning to address those issues head on, so you have a more sustainable way to build your territories and quotas in a more sustainable way. So with all that in mind, I want to leave the group here with some takeaway tactics. A lot of folks are going into their sales planning process right now, and we want to leave you with some tactics that can really help you nail this process and go into next year from a strong spot. So, Andrew, I want to pass to you, if you don't mind, just to walk through these different items and provide some color into what those might look like.
Yeah, absolutely. As I mentioned, I think this is planning this time of the year is really where teams, RevOps teams, operations teams can differentiate themselves within organizations. And just to summarize some of the takeaways from the conversation that Quentin and I had before our demo of our solution, it boils down to these 4 areas. So the first one for me is really clearly taking the time to define your requirements and the timelines. That goes back to that more program project management framework and structure, and formalizing, what are the steps, the timelines, the roles and responsibilities that we are all going to have during this territory and book of business carving process. I think the next thing is to do your work ahead of when you step into territory carving. So we talked about right now, we're kind of in the season of planning. Typically, territory carving happens a bit before the fiscal year kicks off. So let me say, as an example, for those of us who have February fiscal year starts, we're really not going to get into territory or book of business carving until the late December, January timeframe. So right now is the time where you can take the time to map your current processes from last year. Take the time to do a bit of a retro. What worked last year, what didn't. Document the things that you did, so you're not reinventing the wheel this time. And then taking the time to understand, what are the friction points that came up last year? Where did we get slowed down, bogged down? Where did we not account for something? You then can mitigate those friction points by redesigning processes. I am a huge fan of process maps, and they've helped me really here identify where I have inefficiencies and waste in my processes, then taking the time to redesign those and using process maps to make things more efficient. And then the last one is leveraging technology to help scale your efforts. You've got really clear, defined processes, how you're going to approach things. Technology can absolutely be the game changer here to help you scale your efforts and move you away from manual processes. And I think we saw that with what Devin walked us through here as well. We had clear requirements defined and processes of things we're trying to do, and technology can absolutely help us scale and become a lot more efficient in doing it.
So thanks so much, Andrew. And yeah, couldn't agree more, especially on the last bullet there. I think we've seen a lot of folks, already the folks we're starting to work with on the CaptivateIQ planning front, see some better ways to scale this process with CaptivateIQ. So with all that in mind, I want to thank everyone for joining today. We're actually going to hop into a brief Q&A. So if you do have questions that are top of mind right now, please feel free to flag those. And I know we had a couple come in so far, so let me dive into those. Yeah, the first question that we had pop up was around the sales planning process. Specifically, when do you kick off your sales planning process, and how do you usually allocate time to each of those different phases, kind of the way you laid it out? Andrew, here's your perspective on that one.
Yep. So when I think about how much time we account for planning, I think about in terms of our average sales cycles for our business segment. So here at CaptivateIQ, our enterprise sales segment has about a 6-month sales cycle. So really our planning process should kick off about 6 months before the fiscal year starts. Now, that's not deep planning the way that people think about it today, but we're starting to think about what's working, what's not working, and then starting to build a bottoms-up framework of how we want to approach this next year. When I think about the time allocated to each of those areas, I actually start with the endpoint in mind. So typically companies will have we want to go live with the changes for this next fiscal year by a certain date. And I use that endpoint to then back what we mentioned in using more program structures. What is my work back schedule? Then based on my work back schedule, how much time do I have for each of the various components, and then how much time do I need as well, and then use that to calibrate our timing appropriately. Typically, I do about a month and a half of carving, territory book of business carving, plus feedback, plus getting ready to load that for the field, and getting ready to prep all the documentation for the change management to the field. So if I have a fiscal year start in February and we're kicking off to the sales team February 15th, I am deeply starting my territory carving and book of business carving process at the end of December because of holidays. I'm typically getting started the middle of December.
That's super helpful, Andrew. And yes, can attest, Andrew's a project management extraordinaire on that front. So I've seen him put together these work pack schedules, and I really think that sets up a project for success from the front rather than chasing your tail later on. So really appreciate that insight. The last question I've seen so far is, what metrics are you usually using to assess if territories are truly equitable? What are you usually measuring those on?
It's going to be different for each business and how you go to market, but I'll give some clear examples, maybe to spark some inspiration for those of us that aren't entirely sure. So let's take, for example, an enterprise business, an enterprise segment where we have large Fortune 100, Fortune 500 accounts that we're going after with established relationships, and we've already landed that account, but we want to grow that account. So when I think about territory equity there, it's very territory book of business equity there. It's very different than maybe the way that I think about an SMB segment. Metrics there are really going to be aligned to probably custom quotas I'm setting for each of those enterprise AEs. And so do they have a fair shot at hitting their custom quota? And then looking to see that that equity is balanced across the team for the quota that they've respectively been assigned. Now, if I think about maybe a mid-market or SMB territory, let's say, for example, we're taking the approach where we are carving zip code-based territories for our books of business for our SMB or mid-market reps. One of the things that I would look at for equity there then is the propensity of a given zip code to generate a certain amount of revenue based on historical and then some future analysis, some forward-looking analysis. And then I look to create equity amongst each of the various territories for each of our SMB reps. Our SMB or mid-market reps typically carry the same quota, so they should have the same potential to hit their quota. So my territory equity there looks like potential for a certain patch of business, book of business territory to generate a certain amount of revenue. What that then looks like, though, if that was equity in that example, is you could have one rep that has one zip code in San Francisco, and there's another rep that has a whole state or multiple portions of states within the middle of the United States, because that is how much territory zip codes they might need to be able to have the same fair shot at hitting their quota.
That's super helpful, Andrew. And it sounds like a lot of it depends on your type of business, but super helpful in context and examples. So I'm sure you have more specifics if folks want to get into it. So awesome. Well, that looks like all of our questions for the day. I want to thank everyone for taking the time to join us today, and thank Andrew and Devin for providing their expertise on both sales planning and the broader process. If you do have any follow-up questions or would like to learn more from the team, feel free to reach out to any of us directly on LinkedIn, or you can request a demo to see more in depth on the product on our website at CaptivateIQ.com. So thanks everyone so much, and hope you enjoy the rest of your week here. Thanks, team. Bye.